The aircraft that you're seeing here is not just another crazy idea that someone else dreamed up. No, the Sonic Cruiser was actually something that Boeing really worked on, even registering patents to its design and presenting it to their airline customers.
The first unveiling of the Sonic Cruiser.
And they also took it really seriously. Even though it was never built, many of the technologies that came from it and even much of the concepts behind it eventually led to the creation of an actual Boeing aircraft. Stay tuned. A few weeks ago, I launched a video series here on the channel called The Classics about airliners and other aircraft that truly left their mark on aviation history. This video is obviously going to be a little bit different since the aircraft in it is much more recent and never even entered service. But it was still important in its own way, and to start us off and also give you a little bit of background info, I am going to talk about an old classic, although one that sadly didn't make a very big mark in commercial aviation. And that's really a shame, because what I am talking about is the stunning looking Convair 990. Now, it's fair to say that Convair isn't a household name today, but that wasn't always the case. Convair has plenty of history as an aircraft manufacturer, going all the way back to World War II. The company was created from the merger of Consolidated and Volt-E, which happened during the war, and later on they continued making both civil and military aircraft. In the late 1950s, Convair was very much in its heyday, especially on the military side. They also made some piston engine airliners, but when it came to jets, they had been a bit late to the game. Boeing's 707 entered service in October of 1958, with the Douglas DC-8 following suit around 11 months later, and Convair launched its own jet airliner, the Convair 880, in May 1960. Now, I've covered the story of the 707, which was obviously the undisputed king of this first generation, with over 1,000 of them entering service, and then came the DC-8, which came in second with just over half as many produced. But the Convair 880 unfortunately was widely regarded as a failure, with only a measly 65 aircraft built in total. So why was this then? Well, to start with, the 880 had a 5 abreast economy seating, unlike the DC-8 and the 707, which sat 6 passengers on each row, and this seems to have been a big factor in the jet's poor sales performance. It was just considered too small, and with a capacity of only 110 passengers, it was never going to be anything else. And on top of that, it also had a shorter range than both of its competitors, but it was a little bit faster than them. Beyond that, the only really notable thing about the Convair 880 was that Elvis Presley actually bought one. The aircraft remained in production for only around 3 years and ultimately created a big loss for Convair, but the company still believed that they had a solid design, so they wanted to try to find a fix for it. Since Convair couldn't compete with the others on efficiency, they thought that they could maybe make a niche in the speed department instead. And since the 880 was already a bit faster than the others, Convair marketed their new model, the 990, as an even faster jet with enough range to complete transcontinental journeys. The 990 was a bit longer than its predecessor and was modified further to increase both its range and speed. The goal was to be able to fly 150 passengers against the wind on a westerly route, for example from New York to Los Angeles, non-stop with a cruise speed of Mach 0.89. These specifications proved to be a bit harder than Convair thought when they first started, but the company really tried to achieve them. The 990 had a very innovative early turbofan engine design instead of the 880's turbojets, and it also featured a set of very distinctive pods on the upper rear side of its wings. These were called anti-shock bodies, and their purpose was to reduce wave drag, which happens when part of the airflow of the wings starts to move faster than the speed of sound. These transonic shock waves is something that you as a passenger can actually sometimes still see on the top of even today's airliners. It often looks like a thin optical line that dances parallel to the wing's leading edge, about a quarter or a third in on the wing. The design of these anti-shock bodies was based on research that was brand new at the time, involving something called the area rule. And we'll get back to that a little bit later, but as you have probably guessed, the idea didn't really catch on. Some newer planes actually did use some other variations of the anti-shock bodies combined with the flap track fairings, but in general, today we don't really need them because most planes don't fly fast enough for them to make a real difference, and aircraft using supercritical wings don't need them at all. The Convair 990 did enter service with American Airlines and Swissair, but in terms of sales it did even worse than the 880, with only 37 aircraft built. American Airlines were thinking of buying more of them, but scrapped that idea when the aircraft never really met its promised specifications. It turned out that in practice, the Convair 990 would cruise at Mach 0.84, which was comparable to that of the DC-8 and the 707. It is a real shame that it didn't do better, because period footage of it shows what looks like a really comfortable cabin. Convair made barely over 100 880s and 990s combined, and they never made another passenger airliner after this fiasco. After multiple mergers and acquisitions, the Convair name slowly faded into history, while its former facilities and operations eventually got sold to either Lockheed or McDonnell Douglas. The story of the Convair 990 foreshadowed what eventually would also happen to aircraft like the Concorde, the Tupolev 144, and even the cancelled Boeing 2707 SST. As it turns out, airlines and passengers were more interested in efficient, affordable travel rather than a truly fast aircraft. So, with this being a video about Boeing's Sonic Cruiser, at this point you might think this will be a very short video, right? Well, not so fast. It is impossible to understand the Sonic Cruiser project just by looking at aircraft designs from the 1950s and 60s. In order to really understand it, we need to first look at another aircraft development race that took place in the 1990s. And before we do that, there's this. What is actually the best way to learn maths and physics, you might wonder? Well, in my view, one of them is definitely Brilliant, today's sponsor. Brilliant is an interactive platform with thousands of courses ranging from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, computer science, and much, much more. Whether you're a student interested in aviation or a pilot looking to brush up on your understanding of aerodynamics, the gravitational physics course on Brilliant is a great way to deepen your knowledge. This course covers everything from Newton's law of gravity, the study of forces on objects and their resulting motion through the air, and much more. I've tried it myself, and because it's so interactive, it makes the learning experience both fun and engaging, which is why even my kids are huge fans of Brilliant. Each course is designed for high-velocity learning to help you stay focused and reach your goals fast. So to try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, you can visit brilliant.org/mentor now, or click on the link here in the description. The first 200 of you who does that will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription, and you'll also help supporting my work. Now, let's continue. When Boeing first presented the Sonic Cruiser on the 29th of March 2001, some critics said that they thought it was a 3 days early April's Fool's joke. But it turns out that Boeing were completely serious. In 2001, Boeing had already absorbed McDonnell Douglas, a move that would later be criticized by many as a step away from its past as an engineering-led company and towards one that was more ruled by Wall Street. But the events that led to the Sonic Cruiser project really involved the original, engineering-led and truly innovative part of Boeing. And as strange as it sounds, the aircraft that pushed Boeing down the path towards the Sonic Cruiser was a competitor design that we today know as the Airbus A380. Yes, this takes us back to the mid-1990s, when Airbus was talking to the airlines about what they called the A3XX. This was the start of the epic battle of the super jumbos. Because when Boeing learned of Airbus plans for a double-decker aircraft, their engineers initially wanted to compete by launching one or even more enlarged 747 variants. When we talk about this, it's worth remembering that since the launch of the 747 in the 1960s, Boeing had never extended the length of its fuselage. The 747-300 and 400 had a longer upper deck, but the overall length of the plane did not change. The only exception to this was the shortened 747 SP, which I've talked about in a different video. But during the Super Jumbo battle during the mid-1990s, it seems like Boeing was going to finally change that. In 1996, Boeing revealed plans for 3 possible enlarged 747s called the 747-500X, 600X and 700X. The first 2 would feature a new wing and a fuselage that was to be slightly extended by different amounts, and then the 700X would take things even further with both a longer and a wider fuselage. Boeing worked on these designs for years, but ultimately concluded that there wasn't really a market big enough to support the plans for these supersized 747s. Later, Boeing instead came up with a more modest 747 enlargement plan where they would modify the existing 747 wing and have a more modest fuselage stretch, plus fit some new engines and avionics to it. But the fact that even that plan failed to gain any interest from the airlines confirmed something that Boeing's engineers and researchers had been suspecting for a while. The way that the airlines and passengers were flying long haul was changing. Now, it's also worth to point out here that all of this development work was taking place at a time when there was still some resistance to the idea of more generous extended range twin-engine operations performance standards, or ETOPS for short. These ETOPS rules now allow twin-engine aircraft to fly routes over sea with no alternates close by, but in the mid-1990s it still wasn't clear how easy it would be for new airliners to get ETOPS approvals good enough to make them viable. Airbus bet that quadjets like the 747, the Airbus A340 and later the A380 would continue to rule the skies over the oceans and therefore be the only logical way forward. But by contrast, Boeing made sure that when their 777 entered service in 1995, it did so with a full 180-minute ETOPS approval. That meant that it was allowed to operate 3 hours away single-engine speed from an alternate, and therefore making it viable for basically any oceanic trip. The airlines really liked the 777 design and pressured Airbus to give the same treatment to its Airbus A330, but Airbus refused and instead continues to push the 4-engine A340 for long oceanic trips. And this gave Boeing's engineers an idea. The 777 was obviously a twin jet, but it was still relatively big. If they could design another twin, smaller but still with long enough range to work for long haul and make it fly faster, they could give the airline something they could really use to connect smaller cities directly instead of flying through big airport hubs. Yes, this was indeed another chapter in the battle between hub and spoke, the traditional way for long-haul travel for airlines, and the point-to-point model, which was the up-and-coming one. Passengers seemed to mostly prefer the point-to-point because that meant that they didn't have to change flights halfway through, which made their travel quicker. So it looked like speed and convenience still maybe was a strong bargaining chip. And this finally brings us to the purpose of the Sonic Cruiser. Since both the airlines and their passengers like the speed of point-to-point travel, why not compound this speed further by making a really fast twin jet, one that would cruise at Mach 0.98? Now, those of you who did physics at school know that going fast comes with a fairly big penalty. Drag increases with the square of speed, meaning that when you double the speed, drag gets 4 times bigger. But Boeing's engineers had some very good reasons to believe that they could pull this off without making the Sonic Cruiser inhibitively fuel-thirsty. First, there was some fresh research from NASA on the topic of transonic and supersonic travel, as I explained in my video about the Tupolev 144. But the main factor that made Boeing's engineers favor the Sonic Cruiser concept was the use of composite materials like carbon fiber. Composites can make for lighter structures, which helps to reduce the fuel burn, but they also have a few more characteristics that would make them key for this type of aircraft. Because composites can also be useful when engineers want to build large, complicated shapes, and this is particularly true for pressurized structures like an aircraft fuselage. And to understand why that is so important, we have to return back to the area rule that I mentioned before. Now, imagine slicing an aircraft like a cucumber front to rear, including the fuselage, its wings and control surfaces, etc. What the area rule says is that the cross-section of each slice should increase and decrease as smoothly as possible from nose to tail. This will minimize wave drag, which is a huge factor when the aircraft starts to move into the transonic and subsequently the supersonic speed regime. But what this means in practice is that, for example, where the fuselage meets the wing, the fuselage should get a bit slimmer to account for the thickness of the wing. This would require the fuselage to have this thin waist where it meets the wing, basically a Coke bottle shape, and you can actually see exactly this shape on some supersonic military jets. The Convair F-102, for example, was redesigned during development with a Coke bottle fuselage to better conform to this rule. But fighters and other military jets that follow this rule have only a pressurized cockpit. Unlike an airliner, they don't need to pressurize the rest of their sculpted and curved fuselage. This is why, for example, the Concorde had a perfectly straight fuselage, even though its engineers absolutely knew about the area rule and could have used it to make Concorde even faster and more efficient. But they were working with aluminium. Plus, they also had to deal with the high temperatures associated with flying at Mach 2. So they had to settle with the simpler, straight design instead of using the area rule. But with these new fantastic materials, the Sonic Cruiser would not be bound by these same limitations that the earlier types had been. But remember, Boeing had already been bitten by supersonic airliner endeavors earlier with the failed Boeing 2707 SST. As I explained in my recent video about that aircraft, it was simply too ambitious, being both bigger and faster than the Concorde, and it nearly bankrupted Boeing when it was cancelled.
And we are talking about a plane in the end of the 60s that will move ahead at a speed faster than Mach 2 to all corners of the globe.
So this time, Boeing's engineers thought that they would play it safe, adapting existing research to a much more conservative design. This design would not be quite supersonic, it would instead cruise at Mach 0.98, so close to Mach 1, and that just makes things much easier. It would, for example, enable them to more easily use high bypass turbofan engines, and it would also solve a lot of the friction temperature related problems that would come with supersonic speeds. Boeing was betting big on composite materials in this design, which they saw as the ideal solution for this type of use. A Boeing patent from back in the day when the development was going on gives us a lot of insight into how the design features of this aircraft would have made it operationally feasible. They also show the importance that Boeing's engineers placed on the area rule and how they would take advantage of it. Now, as a general rule, it's a bad idea to fully trust patent documents because they often exist just to lock down certain features, not to show a true depiction of an actual plan. In fact, they often can be deliberately misleading in that regard. But looking at the general configuration of the Sonic Cruiser, its fuselage was going to be wide near the nose. Then as the delta wing got broader, the fuselage slowly started to taper, growing thinner. The rest of the aircraft's configuration also had some features of supersonic jets, like the delta wing and the canards near the nose, who actually looked a bit like the ones on the Tupolev 144, except that these ones wouldn't be retractable. And crucially, the Sonic Cruiser would have 2 engines, not 4, both of them buried into the rear structure of the aircraft so that their intakes were below the wing. Boeing's engineers really believed that they could offset the higher fuel consumption associated with flying at Mach 0.98 by simply optimizing the aerodynamics of the Sonic Cruiser. And airlines like Virgin Atlantic and American Airlines were really enthusiastic about this new design. And also, none of those airlines had showed any real interest in the Airbus A380, making them perfect customers for Boeing's now radically different market idea with the Sonic Cruiser. And incidentally, Airbus announced its A380 formally just days before Boeing unveiled the Sonic Cruiser for the first time, and that was probably not a coincidence. A smaller, very fast point-to-point airliner was really attractive to a lot of people, and obviously it was an example of a forward-thinking, engineering-led Boeing company that really contrasted themselves from Airbus. So why didn't it happen? Well, there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, some analysts believe that Boeing's numbers for the aircraft's range and speed, and therefore its efficiency, likely were a bit optimistic. Boeing had been adamant that the aircraft wouldn't be less efficient than other aircraft flying at the time, and that likely didn't really hold up. And with that, like Convair discovered with the 880 and 990 designs, the airlines simply preferred the extra efficiency that they could gain at a slower speed, and obviously the extra range that would come with that. And also, in reality, the benefits of flying a bit faster weren't as earth-shattering as Boeing's researchers had thought. For a 3,000 nautical mile journey between New York and London, for example, a typical jet today would take between 6 and 7 hours to complete that flight. In practice, the faster speed of the Sonic Cruiser would reduce this by around 1 hour, meaning a time saving of around 20% or so. Now, I'm sure that many of you would appreciate that, but for the airlines, making such connections work would run into some operational problems. Scheduling these faster flights so that they would depart and arrive at the right time for each time zone is a bit more complicated than it actually seems, and this is especially true when you consider that the airline would also have to fit the schedule to their Sonic Cruiser alongside the rest of their non-Sonic Cruiser fleet. And finally, another reason why the Sonic Cruiser project was scrapped was that it was just having some really bad timing. As I'm sure some of you noticed when I said it earlier, Boeing unveiled it in March 2001, and a few months later, 9/11 would completely change aviation forever. With many airlines struggling to survive after that, suddenly the idea of a super sleek, super fast, but somewhat ambitious airliner just made no sense. But for Boeing, the Sonic Cruiser program was not a complete loss. Their ideas about the point-to-point versus hub-and-spoke operations were fundamentally correct, and their technological advances on composites were absolutely on the money. As I'm sure many of you know, all of these ideas and technological advances ultimately led to the 7E7 concept, with E meaning efficiency. That aircraft is flying successfully today as the 787 Dreamliner. Its composite fuselage, which made its large windows possible, and its use of electrics instead of bleed air to pressurize the cabin and power many other systems, are all ideas that Boeing started developing for the Sonic Cruiser. They just had to adapt them to a shape closer to what they already knew. Now, I hope that you liked this video, and if you did, leave a like, a comment and subscribe to the channel. If you want to support the work that me and my team does, then please consider joining my awesome Patreon crew. I have lovely Zoom hangouts with them whenever I can, and I've just finished sending out this year's Patreon gifts for those who have registered addresses. Now, check out these videos next, which I know that you will like, and buy yourself a classic t-shirt. There are links to it in the description below. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.